مساء الخير جميعا. Sorry, I will switch to English for those. So on behalf of the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies and Sheikh Zayed, Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies, and Mohammad Atallah, Chair for Ethics at American University of Beirut, I am so honored to welcome you all and to have this event, book launch of the book. We have it here, Mysticism and Ethics in Islam. And we have with us the three editors, unfortunately online, and then it will be a debate with those who are here. First, we will have Bilal Urfali. He's a Sheikh Zayed, Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies at the American University of Beirut, and previously held the MS Sophia Chair in Arabic Studies at the Ohio State University, alongside being the co-editor of the Journal of Al-Abhath and Bridge Text and Studies on the Quranic series, the author and editor of more than 20 books in the field of literature, Sufism and Quranic studies. Sorry, I need to intervene of silencing some people who are here. I don't know who is talking. Yeah, okay, mute. Okay. And then we will have Professor Muhammad Rustom. He is a professor of Islamic thought at Carleton University. He's the author of the award-winning book, The Triumph of Mercy, Philosophy and Scripture in Mulla Sadra, published in 2012. And he is co-editor of the study Quran, a new translation and commentary in 2015, and author of Unrushes of the Heart, the Sufi philosophy of Ain al-Qudat, forthcoming this year, or next year actually. We still have 1 month. And finally, the third editor, Atif Khalil. He is Associate Professor of Religious Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Lethbridge, where he teaches courses on Islamic mysticism, theology, philosophy, and art. He is the author of Repentance and the Return to God, 2018, and numerous articles on Sufism. He is currently writing a monograph on dhikr in classical Islam. And then I will leave this debate to my dear friend Bashar Haider. He is professor of philosophy and Muhammad Atallah Chair in Ethics at EUB. He worked in the area of moral theory, applied ethics, and aestheticism. And he will introduce Professor Suad Hakim and Dr. Hina Ismail. Most welcome. Okay, so Bilal, I give you the floor now.
Thank you, Sari. Do you all hear me? Okay, very good. Well, I would like to start by thanking you, Sari, for organizing this book launch. So thank you, and شكر موصول طبعا ل my colleague Bashar Al-Haider and my colleague Hina Ismail and أستاذتنا الدكتورة سعد Al-Hakim as well. And I of course would like to thank the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, Muhammad Atallah Chair for Ethics, and the Sheikh Zayed Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies. The volume we are launching today carries the title of Mysticism and Ethics in Islam. It is perhaps useful to start by explaining that what we mean by mysticism here is Sufism, because before we started, Sari just noted that, oh, the book is about mysticism and not Sufism, right? And it's actually a long debate whether Sufism is Islamic mysticism or not, have been the subject of an intense debate in the field of Islamic studies. For our purpose, we use the term...
Can you raise your voice maybe a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll also speak closer to... Okay. For our purpose today, we use the terms interchangeably without denying that there are other Muslim groups in Islam that have mystical dimensions as well. What is mysticism or Sufism? I will start by defining this because we have many students with us today and they might not be familiar with the tradition. So I will try to define the term Sufism and what we mean by Sufism here, and then I'll present the volume and the content of the volume. And I will leave it to my colleagues, Mohammad Rustam and Atif Khalil, to talk about the ethical part of the volume and its relation to mysticism. So what is mysticism or Sufism? All things start and end with definitions. Of course, we tend to define things also as we experience them. Like the four blind men describing the elephant in one famous tale of Rumi, it's also a Hindu tale, by the way. None of them was wrong, but none was right. I will avoid defining Sufism here, as definitions of the term, its origin and connotations considerably differ depending on whether we are outsiders or insiders to Sufism. Instead, I will describe the phenomenon by looking at major Sufi practices and beliefs. So I will define Sufism by looking at what do Sufis do. Sufis are a group or groups, I must say, in the plural, of people who try to answer the question, how can we become closer to God? Their example is the Prophet. They want to polish the mirror of their hearts to be able to reflect the light of the divinity, to become perfect humans, insan kamil. Sufis attempted to achieve this goal in various ways, and naturally several Sufi groups can be distinguished from the very early period. There are the ascetics, az-zuhad, who emphasized abstention from pleasures, belongings, and focused on fighting the desire and the base self, al-hawa wal-nafs, in an activity commonly called the greater jihad. There are the sober Sufis, who leave a room for reason and the intellect. Meanwhile, there are those who advocated ecstatic behavior. The people of the blame, the Malamatiya, called the Sufis to hide their identities as Sufis and mask their behavior with professions. Some Sufis want to unite with the divinity. The example here is a drop of water that is uniting with the ocean in order to be preserved. The drop becomes the ocean. Some Sufis witness God in everything they say. He is present in the mosque, but also in the tavern. Some take the concept of al-insan al-kamil, the perfect human, to another level, to the haqiqa Muhammadiyya. You reach reality or the truth in the Prophet Muhammad. You, as a human being, reflect the light of the Prophet. You have the haqiqa Muhammadiyya. Sufis in general act as if God is watching them all the time. We call this the level of ihsan. This is a reference, of course, to the famous hadith in the Arba'in Nawawiyya of Gabriel teaching Muhammad, the Prophet, Islam, Iman, then ihsan. And Sufis flourish in this category, that is the ihsan. They attempt to take Islamic practices to the next level. Sufis want to remember and mention God through the individual or collective act of dhikr. The aim is to reawaken mystical knowledge and feeling, to cause the person or listener to remember. Dhikr, of course, points to the archetypal moment of divine awareness, the Primordial Covenant, Yawm al-Mithaq. On this pre-existential day that is foundational in Sufism, of course, and in Islam in general too, on this pre-existential day described in the Quran, before their creation, human beings had stood witness in the forms of specks of light in Alam al-Dhar. They stood witness to God's lordship, thus acknowledging their standing vis-a-vis God as servants. God asked them, "Am I not your Lord? Alastu bi rabbikum?" They affirmed, "Bala." The Sufis' aim is to reenact the witnessing of the day of the Primordial Covenant through constant collection of God, dhikr. Thus, the role of dhikr is to remind the Sufis of this intimate moment. This can be done through chanting God's names, singing, reciting poetry with music, or dancing. So Sufism became one of the most omnipresent aspects of the Muslim civilization. If you are a villager in the Balkans, or a merchant in Indonesia, or a boat captain in Malaysia, throughout many centuries, one of the ways you would interact with your fellow Muslims is through the practice of Sufism. So things like collective chanting of the names of God, reciting poems, playing music in a Sufi lodge became very common. This became a social activity and institutionalized throughout the Islamic world. Sufi lodges are to be found in most, if not all, Islamic cities. So I'm not talking about an eccentric, a group of, a few followers. No, it's very omnipresent in Islam. And in these Islamic cities, inhabitants and travelers meet to seek the guidance of a Sufi master or the blessings of a saint. At a very early period in the history of Sufism, we see Sufis who not only spoke of a kind of knowledge that was a fruit of mystical realization, but also of the states, ahwal, and stations, maqamat, which led to the end of the path and the realization of this knowledge itself. These usually began with repentance, tawbah, and then proceed through the cultivation of other qualities of the soul, such as patience, gratitude, detachment, contentment, fear, hope, trust, love, longing, and intimacy. While their order, number, and precise features varied from one master to another, their acquisition entailed not only getting rid of their corresponding vices, but also a general process of self-transcendence, where one peeled away baser qualities of the self, stripping away the thick layers of the ego in order to encounter the divine presence that resides in the heart. التخلق بأخلاق الله, which is a phrase that you will see in almost every single article in this volume. التخلق بأخلاق الله. Thus, the focus in early Sufi literature was by and large not on expositing metaphysical doctrines, although these were not absent, of course, but on the rules that governed the inward transformation that accompanied and made the fallen soul's return home possible. In a general sense, this involved the convergence of overlapping domains. So virtual ethics, moral psychology, moral theology, and mystical theology combined to give Sufi ethics its distinctive character. I'll leave this to my colleagues Mohammad, Rustom, and Atif Khalil to talk about the nature of the Sufi ethics after I have presented what Sufism is to you, or mysticism. But apart from some studies and books, the relationship between Sufism or Islamic mysticism and ethics is therefore largely untilled land. The present volume attempts to survey this fertile area of investigation by attempting to come to a clearer idea of precisely what is meant by the terms ethics and mysticism vis-a-vis Islam and vis-a-vis each other. The readers will note that some of the articles in Mysticism and Ethics in Islam do not have an eye so much on defining what mysticism and ethics in Islamic civilization are, but more on coming to terms with the parameters and boundaries within which they have historically fallen and been conceptualized. This allows us to better demarcate the terms, issues, concepts, and even figures which must be taken into account when approaching the question of the relationship between mysticism and ethics in Islam from past to present. For the most part, this volume that we celebrate today falls into 4 clearly demarcated time periods: early classical, late pre-modern, and modern and contemporary. Taken as a whole, these sections give us rich insights into some of the most important Sufi ideas and expressions which have animated the tradition, zeroing in on how concepts such as wealth and ownership, or grief and God-awareness factor into the spiritual life, and why the pursuit of love and human wholeness have always been envisioned as its ultimate end. Other articles in the volume examine the form and function of ethics and spiritual practice in the writings of several major Sufi authors and even philosophers and rational theologians influenced by Sufism. Ghazali is an example. Hailing from various regions of the Islamic world, ranging from Egypt and India to Central Asia and China as well. Still, other contributions seek to outline the different genres and writing styles that have enshrined a range of familiar and not so familiar Sufi literary tropes, motifs, and images. Since Sufism is, of course, not only a historical tradition, but one that also has shaped and continued to shape the texture of ethical and spiritual discourse in the modern world, a good degree of emphasis in the book is dedicated to coming to terms with this important insight. What makes the modern reception of Sufism particularly interesting is, of course, the colonial and post-colonial context in which it has been performed. The papers in the last section of this collection, therefore, examine how the classical Sufi tradition was received, naturalized, and refigured by some of the most important 19th and 20th century Sufi personalities against the backdrop of these two contexts and in regions as diverse as West Africa and Russia. In terms of Sufism and ethics today, we had originally conceived of including a chapter on the important contemporary Moroccan philosopher and mystic Abdurrahman Taha. Yet, given the fact that there are now 2 exceptional volumes dedicated to exploring his ethics in English, we decided to conclude our volume with a contribution on the surprisingly understudied ethical thought of Sayyid Hussein Nasr, whose critique of modernity and alternative Islamic metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology predate those of Taha by some 2 decades. This volume grew out of a conference which was held at the American University of Beirut on May 2nd and 3rd, 2019, under the auspices of the Sheikh Zayed Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies at the American University of Beirut, and was organized by myself, Radwan al-Sayyid, and Mohammad. The event marked 100 years since the birth of the late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, the founder of the United Arab Emirates, who was famous for embodying the ethical ideas and values discussed throughout our volume. And this week, today, we actually celebrate 50th anniversary of UAE. So this volume celebrates the founder and the country as well. 16 of this collection's 25 contributions are derived from papers delivered at the conference, while the remaining 9 represent contributions that came our way after it had concluded. We, of course, tried to fill the gaps to see for example, which region was not represented or which topic was not there. So we tried our best to fill these gaps. Ridwan Sayyid's important role as a co-organizer was matched by the editorial efforts of Atif Khalil, who replaced him as co-editor of this volume. I seize this opportunity and I conclude to thank my co-editors. It was a pleasure to work with them, Mohammad Rustum and Atif Khalil. I also thank Yasmin Hajjar and Claire Leder Miloy for working as copy editors for this volume and for also supervising its publication with the American University of Beirut Press. And this is also the first book in a new series, the Sheikh Zayed series for Arabic and Islamic studies. So thank you, Zayed.
Thank you so much, Bilal. And this is really the fruit of this amazing work and the workshop you talk about it. So now I give the floor to Muhammad Rustum. So I was indulgent with Bilal because he is my dear friend. So no, I'm joking. So I give him more time, but you and Atif each 15 minutes. Thank you so much, Muhammad.
Colleagues, if it's all right with you, we're gonna have Atif go next because we kind of coordinated it, and I think that it makes more sense if he follows. Yeah,
I'll begin.
Okay, Atif. So go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. If you raise your voice, will be better.
A well-known hadith tells us that one day the Prophet Muhammad was in the presence of his companions when he was approached by the angel Gabriel, who appeared in the form of a man. He asked the Prophet to explain the meaning of Islam. The Prophet replied by delineating the 5 pillars of practice. That is to say, the shahada, prayer, fasting, the zakat, and pilgrimage. When asked about iman, the Prophet listed the 6 pillars of faith, namely belief in God, prophecy, the angels, the scriptures, the final day, and the divine measuring out. And then when the Prophet was asked about ihsan, the Prophet replied by saying that it is that you worship God as if you see him, for even if you do not see him, he nevertheless sees you. For many authors in the Islamic tradition, these prophetic responses came to designate the 3 spheres which encompass Muslim life. That is to say, the spheres of right action, right thinking, and doing the beautiful, ihsan. By extension, the areas of knowledge that covered these domains, respectively, came to be identified with law, whose focus is the body, theology and philosophy, whose focus is the mind, and Sufism, the focus of which is the heart. Since the locus of ihsan is the human heart, this 3rd dimension of the religion came to be directly related to introspection, interiority, and the cultivation of the virtues of the heart, beginning with ikhlas or sincerity. This explains why ihsan has been commonly equated with the science of tasawwuf in the Islamic tradition. Now, as a historical phenomena, the precise origins of Sufism have been the subject of extensive debate in Western scholarship. From the point of view of the tradition itself, needless to say, the tradition is to be retraced to the inner life of the Prophet, his own mystical experiences, as well as certain teachings that were transmitted to a select group of companions who in turn taught others as they moved to regions as diverse as Kufa, Fustat, Khorasan, and Basra in the rapidly expanding Islamic world. Basra was particularly important for the development of ideas and practices later associated with tasawwuf, since it was here that the great Abu Musa al-Ash'ari was placed in charge not only over the affairs of the city, but also of teaching the recital of the Quran. Famous for his own austere life, as well as his sermons that aroused a fear of the resurrection and a desire to break one's ties with the world, he helped to shape the religious ambience and milieu of the city and to carve out the contours of a mode of piety for those serious about seeking God. Among the most important of the successors of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari was Hassan al-Basri, who would also emphasize the need to nurture detachment, humility, self-discipline, the fear of God, and scrupulous self-accounting. More than 2 centuries later, Abu Talib al-Makki would credit Hassan al-Basri with laying the foundation for the science of the heart, or ilm al-khulub, a name which for many would be identified with Sufism. The communities out of which the early Sufi tradition would sprout included the Qurra'a, the Quran reciters, the Qussas, the preachers, the Bakka'un, the weepers, the Ubbad, the worshippers, and the Nusak, the ascetics. The role that the love of God played in the spiritual quest in this climate cannot be ignored, even if one questions the historicity of the many legends concerning the great female mystic Rabi al-Hadawiyya, which depict her as the archetype of the selfless lover of God. The emergence of Sufism as a distinct phenomena, however, is usually traced to the so-called school of Baghdad. By the end of the 8th century, Baghdad was a thriving multicultural metropolis where various currents of thinking merged to produce a rich intellectual and spiritual climate. As far as the school of Baghdad, its towering personality was Junayd, a silk merchant by trade, who studied the religious sciences under the tutelage of some of the leading scholars and saints of the day. The formation of his ascetic mystical outlook came through mentors that included his uncle Sari al-Sakhati and al-Harith al-Muhasibi. While these two figures differed considerably on the value they attached to rational theology, both were deeply affected by the ideas, the fledgling ideas in the early Islamic tradition. Now, as far as the focus of early Sufi literature was concerned, most of it was by and large focused not on expositing metaphysical doctrines, although these were not absent, but on the rules that governed the inward transformation that accompanied and made the fallen soul's return home possible. In a general sense, this involved the convergence of overlapping domains, what in modern academic parlance we might call virtue ethics, moral psychology, moral theology, and mystical theology, that combined to give Sufi ethics its distinctive character. At the heart of this convergence, there lay a conviction in the belief that the human being is in a state of exile from a homeland to which he or she can only return through the inner life. In other words, the exile of Adam and Eve, which began the drama of human terrestrial existence, involved not only a descent, but also a corresponding exteriorization. Not only was it a fall, it was also an inversion that cast the human being away from his own center. If the outward message of prophecy brought a method to return to the God of paradise above, its inward message, as articulated by the Sufis insofar as they were the inheritors of the prophets, brought a method to return to the God of paradise within, in the eternal now. The ethical concerns of the Sufis always lay at the forefront of their teachings, even if ethics was, in the final analysis, no more than a means to an end that transcended it altogether. This distinctive feature of their literary output was highlighted decades ago by the University of Chicago historian of Islam, Marshall Hodgson, when he observed that, to quote his words directly, most Muslim mystical writers have spent far more time speaking of the everyday virtues as they appear in the mystical perspective than of ecstasies or even of the cosmic unity these ecstasies seem to bear witness to, end of quote. Even a work such as Ibn al-Arabi's Futuhat al-Makkiyah, which is often considered to be an encyclopedia not of praxis, that is to say ilm al-muhamala, but of the knowledge of unveiling, ilm al-mukashafa, dedicates lengthy sections to the virtues as they appear in the mystical perspective. To be sure, in no sub-tradition of Islam has so much collective intellectual energy been devoted to probing the ontology and teleology of the virtues as we find in Tasawwuf. And this, as noted, rested on the Sufis' conviction that the inner journey remained impossible except through tabdil al-akhlaq, as Professor Bilal Orfali pointed out. That is to say, it lay in the conviction of the Sufis that the inner journey required a transformation of character. This was why as early a figure as Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi could say of the Abdal, that is to say the substitutes, who are a special class of awliya or God's friends in the hierarchy of saints, that they were given this name, that is to say they were named Abdal, on account of having replaced or substituted through a tabdil their vices or base character traits for virtue or noble character traits. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atif for your presentation and highlighting the importance of Baghdad as a center for mysticism and Sufism in the history of classical Islam. Muhammad, Rustom, Dr. Muhammad, you have the floor. Can you unmute yourself?
How is that? Is my volume good?
Yeah.
All right.
But raise your voice, please, if you can.
Yes. All right. How's this? Is this better? I'll speak more into the mic. How is that?
Yeah, fine.
Better? All right, good. Thank you. Well, I wanted to first thank all of the individuals involved in bringing this event together. And that's quite a long list, and Bilal has already thanked everybody on our behalf. But I thought, we need to. وَأَمَّا بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ فَحَدِّثْ. So I like to re-thank everybody, just because it really is a historic coming together of different perspectives, and it's amazing that it's being done, and it's been done at AUB and under the auspices of the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, and of course the Sheikh Zayed Chair for Arabic and Islamic Studies, and then we're also now included here as the Mohammad Atallah Chair for Ethics. So I thank everyone that's involved in these amazing institutions at AUB. On an individual level, of course, Professor Bashar Haidar, Professor Suad al-Hakim, Professor Ghina Ismail, and Professor Sari Hanafi. Thank you all very much for facilitating this discussion, for your good opinion, and for giving us a chance and an opportunity to speak about, what we consider to be a very distinctive kind of book for the field, not just of Islamic studies, but as I hope to impress upon you today, also for the field of global philosophy. So if we keep in mind that, there's a tremendous amount of interest in global philosophy today, that is today, teachers and students and the general public, they're all beginning to come away with a clearer picture of what philosophy means in various civilizations and to large sectors of humanity beyond the Anglo-American and European worlds. Now, although this would seem to be a rather intuitive insight, contemporary scholars and students have nothing near to what we would call a fair, representative portrayal of the depth and epistemic diversity and creativity of non-Western philosophical traditions. And of course, by that I would mean, traditions such as Africana, Aztec, Buddhist, Confucian, Hindu, Islamic, Jain, Jewish, Mayan, Native American, and Taoist philosophy, and their problem sets, which are unique often to them. Such an account would demonstrate just how rich and variegated philosophy is when we consider it as a global phenomenon, addressing, as these traditions do, such major modes of inquiry as being and consciousness, cosmology, epistemology, philosophy of language, aesthetics, logic, storytelling, philosophy of religion, selfhood, death, and freedom. These prefatory remarks are essential for what I would like to say about our edited volume, Mysticism, Ethics, and Islam. One of the guiding assumptions of the conference and the volume was that ethics is a universal problem, and that different ethical worldviews may often be parallel and commensurate, but that they should all be looked at on their own terms and with reference to the inner logic and underlying perspectives of the ethical traditions in question. Now, for its part, modern scholarship informed by Eurocentric categorizations of ethics, virtue, deontology, and human agency has tended to emphasize the influence of Greek ethics on Islamic thought, and this more often than not with reference to the traditions of falsafa and kalam, philosophy and theology. To a certain extent, this is a very sensible mode of inquiry, but to view Sufism and its richly textured, expansive, and historically influential ethical traditions through the same lens is to really miss the point. There are thus two problems here, the second of which builds off of the first. The first problem is that the failure to account for the mysticism and ethics nexus as a native concern of Islamic civilization perpetuates a misunderstanding which has characterized scholarship for far too long. That is the facile notion that Islamic civilization's ethical achievements are to be measured against the ethical achievements of the ancient Greeks. And given this point, the second problem is that the distinctive nature, language, and concerns of Islamic ethics as enshrined in the vast repository of Sufi texts will naturally, consequently, be lost upon us. Now, one example shall suffice. The Sufis have developed a very complicated and involved understanding of the various stages along the Sufi path. These Sufi stations correspond to what we would normally refer to as the virtues, which explains why some modern scholars of Sufism speak of Sufi virtue ethics. If one insists on understanding the Sufi stations or maqamat along solely Greek lines and as informed by Greek ethical categories, well, many of the subtleties that characterize Sufi ethical discourse must be passed over in silence, or we have to pretend that they don't exist. This is because the Sufi stations are what most Sufis, regardless of their intellectual persuasion and manner of expression, understand to really be the stuff of the Sufi path. After all, how are we supposed to understand the Sufi virtue of poverty, faqr, if not through laying bare the inner logic of Sufi ethical discourse and the Sufi emphasis on the dawning of the divine qualities, at-takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, which my colleagues already have spoken of. Likewise, what sense can we make of the Sufi understanding of humility, tawadu', which for many of the ancient Greeks was anything but a virtue? For Aristotle, for example, humility is bad. It's not a good thing. It means you're down. The same can also be said about other Sufi stations, such as witnessing, shuhud, which is considered by some Sufis to be an actual station, and love, which is considered by many Sufis to be the virtue par excellence. Now, the volume Mysticism and Ethics in Islam, I believe, has all of the right ingredients for a massive reevaluation of ethics in Islam and of Islam in ethics. It contributes to problematizing the notion that ethics is only one specific thing, or that it springs from one specific civilization and against which all other civilizations are to be evaluated and judged. In doing so, the volume can therefore allow for much greater conceptual space to be envisioned when it comes to the relationship between things such as mysticism, philosophy, and what we normally call ethics. To be sure, it can help globalize philosophy, taking things to unforeseen heights, such as, for example, the much needed appraisal and evaluation of classical Greek and modern Western ethics in light of Islam's vast ethical traditions. Now, let us just consider for one moment what this would look like. It would mean taking the Islamic ethical tradition as seriously as one would take modern Western ethics, and also making pronouncements and judgments about modern Western ethics and measuring its successes and failures with reference to the ethical discoveries and breakthroughs of Islam's major ethical theoreticians. This alone would allow different non-Western voices to weigh in on the discussion and, dare I say, even improve what we take for granted as a normative, constitutive elements of ethics. Thank you.
Thank you, Muhammad, for your presentation and extending the nexus between mysticism and ethics. I mean, talking specifically about that. So I will give the floor now to Dr. Bashar Haidar. Okay, so yeah. Okay.
Welcome again, everybody. I think we'll have hopefully the chance to go back to the remarks made by Dr. Orfali and Rustom and Ali. But after we also engage with our two guests that we are happy to have with us here, who will add their own perspective on the connection between Sufism and ethics and between Islamic thought and ethics in general. Our first guest is Dr. Zayed Hakim, who is well known in the field of Sufism. I will speak in Arabic now about Dr. Hakim. I hope most people here understand Arabic. الدكتور سعاد الحكيم هي أستاذة التصوف علم التصوف في الجامعة اللبنانية ولها باع طويل في هذا المجال وفي العلوم الإسلامية in general بشكل عام، وكانت شغلت بين عام 2007 2010 منصب عميد معهد الدكتوراه في الجامعة اللبنانية الآداب والعلوم الإنسانية والاجتماعية والفنون كذلك، ولها العديد من المؤلفات. أود أن أذكر العديد المؤلفات في التصوف بشكل خاص وفي الفكر الإسلامي بشكل عام. أريد أن أذكر بشكل خاص بكون الاطلاع على مؤلفاتها عبر الإعلان الموجود، ولكن ما ليس موجودا في الإعلان هو آخر كتاب للدكتورة سعاد، وهو الموطأ في علم مكارم الأخلاق، تأصيل علم إسلامي جديد، وهي محاولة موسوعية ولكن أيضا فكرية لوضع أسس لعلم إسلامي مستقل عن العلوم الأخرى، طبعا متداخل ولكن مستقل في مكارم الأخلاق، وهو مستقل عن الفلسفة، علم الكلام، الفلسفة الأخلاقية، وأيضا عن الفقه وغيرها. فهذا هو الكتاب. نتمنى أن نستمع من الدكتور زايد عن الكتاب إلى حد ما، وعلاقة هذا، أو على الأقل ما هي علاقة هذا العلم الجديد أو علم مكارم الأخلاق المستقل بالصوفية. وبعدها ننتقل إلى الدكتورة. بس أنا لست جيد. I'm not good at keeping time. I hope you will discipline yourself. فأنا معنا 10 دقائق للحديث. لكن في مجال للأسئلة أكثر والنقاش.
مساء جميعا، ونشكر حضوركم على الوقت اللي تجاوبوا فيه الاجتماع. صار هادئ، صرنا محاصرين. الموضوع حول علاقة التصوف بالأخلاق. إن الأخلاق اليوم هي مطلب عالمي وحاجة عالمية لعدة أسباب. أذكر 4 من هذه الأسباب. أولاً، التقدم في البحوث العلمية المتعلقة بالجسم البشري، وخاصة في مجال علوم الطب والحياة والهندسة الوراثية. هذه العلوم قد تغير معالم الطبيعة البشرية، وهنا حاجة إلى. السبب الثاني العولمة. العولمة فعلت فعلها في إسقاط الحدود من بين كل شيء وشيء، يعني من بين المجتمعات، من بين الإنسان والآلة، من بين كل شيء وشيء. فإذا الحاجة ماسة للحب. المسألة الثالثة، رجحان كفة القوة على كفة العدالة في العلاقات الدولية، وهذا يعني نعاني منه ومعروف. رابعاً، رغم نشاط بعض قادة الفكر ورجال القانون لتحويل القيم الأخلاقية إلى قوانين، إلا أن فضاءات الحق الأخلاقي أوسع نطاقاً بما لا يقاس من فضاءات الحق القانوني، فليس كل ما هو أخلاقي قابلاً لأن ينتظم في قوانين ملزمة. لذلك لابد من الإصرار على تفعيل الضمير الأخلاقي في المجتمع. بناء على هذه الأسباب ال4 من وجهة نظرنا، كل هذه الأسباب أدت إلى صحوة عالمية جعلت قادة العالم يدركون أن الأخلاق أصبحت مسألة مصيرية، وغياب الأخلاق يشكل خطورة على الجنس البشري بأكمله. لذا صارت الأخلاق محوراً للكثير من الدراسات الفلسفية والاجتماعية، بل يمكن القول أن الفعل الأخلاقي اليوم عالمياً صار متقدماً في الأهمية على الفعل التكنولوجي والإعلامي، لأنه تبين أنه الأكثر نفوذاً وتأثيراً على حياة البشر في مستقبل الأيام. بناء على هذه المقدمة يعني أطرح العلاقة بين التصوف وبين الأخلاق. إن التراث العلمي لرجالات الصوفية يشكل رافداً هاما للأخلاق الإنسانية، وأقول الأخلاق الإنسانية وليس الأخلاق الإسلامية فقط، لأن الأخلاق هي مشترك إنساني وهي مبدأ للعيش معا، يعني لا يمكن العيش معا بدون الأخلاق، حتى في البيت الواحد لا يمكن أن نتعشى بدون الأخلاق. فإذا هي مسألة إنسانية وليس فقط مسألة دينية. والعديد من علماء الصوفية المؤسسين بهذا العلم يقدمون أنفسهم على أنهم حملة الأخلاق الإسلام، اللي بيقدموا أنفسهم أن الأخلاقيين. مثلا الجريري يقول التصافي الأمر معروف هو الدخول في كل خلق سليم والخروج من كل خلق ذميم. والكتان يقول التصوف خلق ومن زاد عليك في الخلق فقد زاد عليك في الصفاء. بينا العلاقة بين الخلق وبين صفاء السريرة وبين زكاة النفس البشرية. يعني كل ما كنا أخلاقيين كل ما كانت سريرتنا نظيفة، كل ما كانت نفسنا يعني زكية. السؤال ماذا نستفيد اليوم من الفضاء الصوفي؟ ما هو الإسلام الصوفي في مجال الأخلاق الإنسانية؟ يعني بظن ممكن التصوف يقدم شيء ليس للمجتمع المحلي، ممكن للمجتمع العالمي. يعني نحن دائما نأخذ عن المجتمع العالمي. أظن أنه في مجالات يقدم التراث يستطيع أن يقدم إضافة تفيد العالم بأجمع، والتصوف يقدم على المستوى الأخلاقي هذه الأمور. أطرح حوالي 7 نقاط، سريعة. أولاً تحرير الإرادة وتقوية عزائم الإرادة. هلا الإرادة مهمة جداً في الفعل الأخلاقي، لأن الاختيار الصواب أحياناً مكلف للإنسان، أحياناً يدفع الإنسان ثمناً باهظاً للالتزام بموقف أخلاقي. من هنا الصوفي هو معلم نظرياً وعملياً في مجال تحرير الإرادة من كل العوائق التي تقوم في وجه قيام الإنسان بالفعل الأخلاقي. مثلاً الخوف على الرزق، على الأمن الذاتي، الخوف على المكاسب المادية، الطمع طبعاً بمكاسب مادية مثلاً. أيضاً مثلاً في كثير من يعني تحرير الإرادة من رق العبودية للدرهم والدينار وكل هالأمور. فإذا هون أساتذة بهذا المجال، بمجال تحرير الإرادة وتقوية عزيمة الإرادة. الناحية الثانية اللي نستفيد منها من التصوف هي تزكية النفس من كل خلق ذميم أو خصلة تفسد الطبع أو شهوة تفسد الغريزة. مثلا هذا مجال ممكن نحن نستفيده من الصوفيين. قدموا الصوفيين أسلوبين لتزكية النفس. الأسلوب الأول لتزكية النفس هو تزكيتها بالأنوار، يعني الأذكار، يعني كل الذكر والصلوات وكل العبادات بتعطي أنوار بالصدر. بس بتعطي أنوار بالصدر بكل ما كنت الأنوار بالصدر بتأثر على الظلم اللي موجود بالداخل. هذا أسلوب. الأسلوب الثاني اللي هو تحرير، يعني تزكية بالتخلي والتحلي، بتخلية القلب عن الصفات المسمومة أو الأخلاق المسمومة، وتحليته بالأخلاق اللي هي تعطي للإنسان قيمة إنسانية، وهي قيمة الإنسان بالخلق، وقيمة الإنسان إنه كان أخلاقي. فمن هون نجد عند الصوفيين يعني في الكتب هون المنظومة الأخلاقية عندهم تحت أسماء متعددة، منازل، مقامات، كل هالأمور، وإنما هي بواقع الحال منظومة أخلاقية. النقطة الثالثة اللي بنستفيد منها الصوفية هي آداب الإسلام. آداب الإسلام هي الآداب ما لها علاقة بالحلال والحرام. الآداب هي آداب كيف نؤدي العمل. مثلا إنه بالطعام والشراب تنفرد في حلال وحرام، وإنما كيفية الطعام، كيف نأكل، يعني الحركات أثناء الطعام، أداء هذا الفعل هو أداء من الآداب. وإذا شفنا كتب الصوفية نجد أنه كثير اهتموا بهذه الآداب. ليش بيهتم الصوفي بهالآداب؟ لأنه صحيح الإنسان إذا أكل بشكل شرس وغير محبب ننفر منه، ولكن لا نستطيع أن نقول لا أخلاق. فالهدف من الأخلاق والهدف من الآداب هو الاجتماع البشري، أن نقبل بعضنا البعض. لأنه يعني كثير من الصعوبة إذا كان التأدية للعمل بشكل منفرد ببطل في اجتماع إنساني، ببطل في لحمة بالجماعة الإنسانية. فمن هون هن أضافوا هالآداب، وبظن الإمام الغزالي كثير أجاد فيه ربع اللي هو العادات، اللي هي آداب الزواج، آداب الطعام، آداب السفر، كل هذه الآداب. رابعاً الفكر والحياة. بيعاني الإنسان عالمنا خاصة بمجتمعاتنا نحن بيعاني من انفصام بين الفكر وبين الحياة. دايماً لما تسأل أي إنسان عن مسألة بيجاوبك من فكره بما يجب أن يكون. إذا نظرت بحياته أحياناً بتلاقي عكس ما يقول. فمن هون العلاقة بين الفكر وبين الحياة فيها شيء من الازدواجية أحياناً كثير، وخاصة بالمحيط اللي فيه شوية قمع وعدم جرأة على إنه الإنسان يكون ذاتي. لهالسبب الصوفي بنلاحظ عنده إنه الفكر عنده هو نتاج للحياة. يعني لا يقول فكرة أو عبارة أو رأي أو رؤية أو أي شيء إلا إذا كان ناتج عن تجربة روحانية أو عن معاناة صوفية أوصلت للأمر. فإذا لا يتكلم عن الفقر إلا إذا بطبيعة الحال مارس هذا الفقر. أهلا حبيبي. فإذا نجي لرقم 5 بعد الفكر والحياة، اللي هو مسألة كثير مهمة ولطيفة عند الصوفي، هي سميتها تقدير الموجود والزهد في المفقود. كثير مهم إنه يكون في عنا ثقافة نقدر ما نملك، نقدر كل شيء نملكه مادياً ومعنوياً، نقدر مثلاً نعمة الصحة، نقدر نعمة العلم، نقدر نعمة الحياة، نقدر كل هالنعم، وبنفس الوقت نزهد في المفقود، بمعنى إنه نزهد بما في أيدي الناس. لأن الزهد بما في أيدي الناس كثير بيعطينا يعني هيك الطمأنينة وعدم النظر إلى ما يملك الآخر، بيروح التحاسد، بيروح التحاقد، بيروح الأنانية. إذا حصل أحد من أصحابنا من أهلنا لنعمل من النعم للشباب الشباب لنال هبة لأي شيء نكون عم نفرح له. ليش؟ لأنه نحن زهدنا بالمفقود وعندنا تقدير له النعمة الموجودة. سادساً وهي تقريباً قبل الأخيرة، التدين بسمة روحانية وحكيمة، يعني بسمة عامة رحمانية وحكيمة. لأنه بتعرفوا أنتم التدين هو أشكال كثير. الحقيقة أن الصوفي قدم لنا عبر التاريخ شكل من أشكال التدين يتصل بالرحمة. فنحن كثير محتاجين خصوصاً بهذا الزمن أن نتعامل مع بعضنا بشيء من الحلم والرحمة. فمن هون إنه كمان معين كثير كبير إنه نشوف هالشكل من أشكال التدين، وليس فقط الرحمة وإنما مع الحكمة. يعني معظم التصوف الإسلامي بتاريخ التصوف يعني أكد على يعني مسألة الرحمة كانت واضحة وموجودة، وإنما مع الشيخ الأكبر محي الدين بن عربي رأينا مسألة الحكمة بالأخلاق وليس فقط الرحمة. لأنه أحيانا إذا تعاملنا بالرحمة بدون حكمة فقد نرحم في موضع يعني يضر الرحمة بالمرحوم وليس بالعكس. يعني هذا السبب نقدر نحن ناخذ من هالمطالعات، نقدر نشوف شكل من أشكال التدين بيقدر يجمع بين الرحمة وبين الحكمة بميزان كثير عادل. آخر مسألة بشير لها بسرعة اللي هو الترقي الأخلاقي مع الأنفاس. لأنه دائما الصوفي يعطينا إحساس إنه الحياة مش تراكم بس، مش ثبات بمكان. الصوفي بيعطينا فكرة السير، فكرة السير وفكرة الطريق. هاي فكرة الطريق كثير فكرة مهمة لحياتنا. لأنه ليش فكرة الطريق؟ لأنه دائما أنا بنتظر إنه بكرة أتحسن، بكرة أصير أفضل، بعد أصير أفضل. فهي فكرة الطريق فكرة كثير مهمة. أيضا نحن فينا نربي الأولاد عليها وهي أحسن من فكرة تقول في عندي هدف في الحياة. لأن لما يكون عندي هدف في الحياة بيكون عندي سير نحو هذا الهدف. بس أنا لما بعتبر حياتي كلها سير بصير أنا سيري مش بس للهدف، بكل مجالات حياتي فيها سير. فمن هون أنا أظن إنه أيضا نحن ممكن نحن نستفيد من الصوفي. طبعا أنا ما عم بقول إننا ننقل الكلام الصوفي لحياتنا، وإنما ناخذ هالكلام الصوفي بعين الاعتبار، نطوره ونحدثه ونجيبه لحياتنا ونعيد سياقته ونعيد يعني تكرينه ونعيد قراءته، كل هالشيء لأنه فعلا بيفيد حياتنا. مش فقط بس نحن يعني صحيح نحن بناخذ عن الغرب وفي أي مانع إن ناخذ عن الغرب في المجال الأخلاقي، بس إذا عنا وجدنا في يعني تاريخنا وفي إرثنا أشياء نستفيد منها ونفيد العالم، بيكون كتير مهم إذا نحن قدرنا مدينا إيدنا وأخذناها وكيفناها مع حياتنا المعاصرة.
شكرا جزيلا. شكرا. أنا ما كنت عم بحاسب على الوقت. Our last but not least speaker for this event is Dr. Ismail. Dr. Ismail is a professor of psychology and social clinic, professor at the medical school in the psychiatry department. He's also the chair of the psychology department. Her work in psychology is varied, but one component of it is linking spirituality to personal well-being and ethical values. And I think from that perspective, she will shed light on the connection between Sufism, spirituality, and ethical values. So, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this very good channel. I haven't prepared a written script because my understanding was that I was invited to comment as a psychologist how I bridge some themes across different disciplines, taking into consideration the book which we're meeting today for the purpose of its launch, and also the perspective of Dr. Zayed, who is also well known in the field of Sufism. So when we read about Sufism, those of you who may be familiar with Sufism even before coming to this panel, you encounter the term Tawheed, which is at the core of Islam in general, not only Sufism in particular. Now, in Sufism, there's an emphasis on how to realize the Tawheed within. I mean, one way in which Sufism has been defined, which is of particular relevance and interest to psychologists, is its focus on what we may refer to as the experiential dimension of Tawheed. In the editor's note, they focus on Tawheed as being linked to ethics because Tawheed implies, to a big extent, the elimination of vices, the assumption of ethical virtues, hence the term that recurred today, الأخلاق لله. Now, in the editor's note, as this link is introduced between Sufism and ethics, there is a reference to the process of self-transcendence. And it's this process that I would like to comment on today from a psychological or psycho-spiritual point of view. So it is this process of self-transcendence, the relationship between self-transcendence as envisaged not only in the Sufi tradition, but spiritual traditions in general. Here I would like to refer to something Dr. Saad Hakim referred to, that when we talk about ethics, it may be at some points more conducive to talk about ethics as a mawruf insani, rather than just a mawruf Islamic, because when it comes to ethics and when it comes to psycho-spiritual ethics, it's difficult to contain it to one tradition. And in specific, of course, I mean, there are different points of emphasis, but there's a lot in common. So in the few minutes that I have to talk, I'm going to focus on this process of self-transcendence and its relationship to having a vision. Reference has been made to a beatific vision, oftentimes when you read about Sufism. I will add a linking theme which is important from a psychological point of view, which is a focus on motives. And here I'd like to quote a saying by Zayed al-Bustami: "The thickest veil between man and God are the wise man's wisdom, the worshipper's worship, and the devotion of the devout." Obviously, Sufis here are not dismissing the important role of prayers, let alone spiritual disciplines in general. However, they are emphasizing the importance of paying attention to one's intentions and motives. So back to self-transcendence, which I'm going to use as a guiding theme in my talk. It's a recurrent theme in Sufi psychological discourse. It's a recurrent theme in spiritual disciplines in general, and it's becoming actually more of a recurrent theme in the discipline of psychology, especially if you consider mindfulness-based traditions that talk about detachment, observing one's ego in a detached manner. If you look at literatures that talk about strengthening the self-observing ego. So when we encounter this term, self-transcendence, which self are we talking about? And obviously in psychology also, we are not for self-destruction. Okay, we actually, a big part of the psychological work is to strengthen one's ego, to strengthen oneself. So what do we mean when we say self-transcendence? Which self are we talking about? Like in Quranic terms, there's a simple answer. We are talking about an-nafs al-ammara. We are talking about this nafs that may be inclined to committing vices. This is the obvious answer, okay? But the focus is not merely on doing good acts and staying away from bad acts and behaviors. The focus is on the motives. Because if you go back to the statement by Zayed al-Bustami, he's saying that even when you're engaged in doing good acts, these good acts may become a source of, may become a barrier between you and reaching a higher station of spiritual realization. And that's not an alien notion to us, even if we take our popular understanding into consideration. You say that somebody has a big ego, okay? And somebody actually may take pride in doing good acts, and they may be engaging in acts of charity, but they take a lot of, they are too proud because of what they're doing. And this is something Sufism and spiritual traditions are particularly warn us about, that the effect of those good acts, even on the soul, may be detrimental. Interestingly, also, it can be the other way around. And that is something that's particularly interesting from a psychological point of view, from a clinical psychology point of view, that seemingly negative acts can sometimes have a positive effect on the soul. For example, I have a client who is used to being unassertive or passive or timid in the face of others who cross his or her boundaries. In the process of trying to coach that person on becoming more assertive, it is unlikely that the person can move from being unassertive or passive to being assertive right away. And I don't know if that makes sense, maybe even intuitively. When you're passive, oftentimes you're harboring feelings of resentment. It doesn't necessarily mean, as implied in the term passive, that you are happy in the face of what's happening. There are negative emotions that are being harbored within, okay? And to eliminate or to address difficult emotions usually takes longer than merely changing a behavior. So as you try to move toward a new, more adaptive or better behavior, you may go to the other extreme because you are still struggling with this difficult emotional repertoire that you're dealing with. So you may actually, as an interim, engage in aggressive behavior. Now, why am I using this example into focus? Because oftentimes you need to convince the individual you're working with that you need to exercise self-compassion as you tread the path toward recovery. You need to allow yourself that you may go to that other extreme until you realize your aim of being assertive. Now, what does that require? It requires also a certain measure of self-detachment or self-renunciation. It requires that you, for a moment, stop judging yourself one way or another. And so, of course, this does not capture the full meaning of self-transcendence as it is studied in Sufi literature, but it actually offers a glimpse into what it means to take a step back from your ego. And the ego doesn't have to always manifest in an obvious negative manner. Taking a step back from the ego can be even taking a step back from what might appear to be positive. It might be allowing yourself to do something that may really appear negative to someone else because of something that occurred also. You are trying to be centered in your own truth, rather than being distracted by how others are going to perceive you. Now, Sufism links this to a supreme ideal, which is encountering the beatific vision of God within you. Now, that's not necessarily something that everybody aspires to. However, what I'm trying to show here is that there is a lot of benefit from familiarizing ourselves with these wonderful Sufi humanistic treatises, even when working with people who do not seek to tread on a Sufi path. Okay? I think there's a lot of possible exchange that can happen across disciplines. So even if you are engaged with people who are not necessarily disciples on the Sufi path, this emphasis of linking your action, okay, to some kind of a beatific vision can help free the individual from this persistent or obsessive process of self-judgment, which is at the root of a lot of illnesses, okay, that we deal with. Okay? The other way around is truthful as well. I mean, Sufis have delineated wonderful methods for reaching their ideal of having, of realizing Tawheed within. I mean, this ideal has been expressed in different ways by different Sufis. But besides the wonderful methods that Sufis have delineated, which include elaboration of spiritual disciplines, of prayers, of being mindful of when, as you engage in these varied methods, they also talk in lots of their treatises about being watchful of the ego and the tricks that the ego can pull you into. Okay? And this is where psychology can be quite powerful, because we specialize as psychologists in noticing patterns at the level of ego. Okay? We specialize in helping people detect patterns that they may not be very happy with, but that they have inherited, okay, because of intergenerational dramas that they have been caught up in. It's difficult to say you're going to take being on a spiritual path seriously if you are not willing to allow yourself to encounter also what's not so nice within. So we talk about the encounter with the beatific vision, which is a beautiful ideal, but that encounter might involve along the way encounter with the dark forces within. And actually Carl Jung, even though, I mean, many religious scholars have a lot of reservations on him, and I'm not here in a place where I can offer a satisfying commentary on Jung, but he talks about an interesting idea in some of his writings in which he tries to tackle the interface between religion and spirituality. He talks about the importance of encountering the dark forces within. Okay, now to take this back to terms that are not as theological or as spiritual, those dark forces within can be what we refer to in modern psychology as pathologies, as illnesses, as patterns people are trying to unblock. Okay? So the idea, the beautiful idea and the applicable idea from Sufism is that to encounter the beatific vision, to encounter the fullness within, you also need to be prepared to encounter the void within, the emptiness and the rigor that may come from having to face not only some external pressures and stressors, but also from having to encounter some internal unresolved issues and tensions. Thank you.
I guess we can now start by asking some questions about the role, the connection between Sufism and ethics. And maybe we can open the floor, but maybe I can start with some remarks, some questions that address to mainly everybody here. Maybe it will be pertaining to some more than others, but we can break the questions as you like, as you seated. Now, if you want to problematize the connection between Sufism and ethics, then one could say that the kind of therapeutic aspect of spirituality and its connection with methods such as mindfulness, and maybe it is a form of polishing of that mirror that Bilal talks about. You keep on polishing that mirror so that you can become in touch with yourself at the same time, not totally identify with your ego, but you have some kind of distance from it, because the act of polishing requires some kind of understanding, and maybe this kind of mudawat nufus, if you want to use the term of Hazm, approach to Sufism. However, one could ask about the connection between Sufism and those virtues that Sufism promotes, and those attitudes, and social life. How you connect, how you can understand moral demands, and what is permitted and what's not permitted. Here we come not only to the virtues, but also how the virtues translate into actions. I can be compassionate, but understand my compassion to be a compassion towards my slave. Not to overburden him with work, not to abuse him, not to, but still I recognize this as an acceptable relationship. Of course, nobody now has slaves, but I could apply this to maybe, I don't know, a man who was his wife. He thinks he, is nice to her, but maybe anybody thinks that being nice to somebody like that, you have to be equal. He also have to offer you to be nice to you. To what extent this polishing of these virtues can shed light on social issues that we as Muslims or Muslim societies face nowadays? Or to go back to Dr. Hakim's example about the extent to which I am required to sacrifice for the sake of doing the right thing. And the answer, as I understand it, is I should be able to sacrifice a lot by abandoning my desire to have a lot. And so I be in a position after polishing that attitude towards material things and other luxuries and other aspirations in life, I can be in a position to actually sacrifice. But it's not clear to me that this is a recipe, that a morally acceptable recipe, in the sense that I would still want to answer, when is my reluctance to sacrifice morally acceptable? If there's a person drowning in front of me and it will cost me my life or my limbs to save the child, I could tell myself it's acceptable not to save the child. It will be heroic if I do, but not morally unacceptable. The compassion I have with the child doesn't itself determine when is it too costly for me to save the child or not, or how much of my income now I should donate to those who are struggling in this country. What extent I should pass by somebody begging in the street and not give, or donate more than I do. Now, if we start from the claim that I should work on myself, become independent of wealth, endorsing faqr in all its meanings that are conducive to ihsan, then there are no limits to that. I can simply be as poor as the person, or slightly better than the person being in the street. To what extent, this is a more concrete example, to what extent this purification, this polishing can translate into questions about equality, about my relationship to others. I could be, I could be a very compassionate employer as a domestic maid. I give her a full day on Sunday, and I don't, but I still have this relationship. I still don't sit with her. We don't eat together at the dinner table. Is that lack of compassion, or I just go to her and make sure that she's eating well, and if you see her crying and say, "What are you crying? Is there a problem?" Or simply the fact they don't allow her to sit with me on the table is itself a problematic one. The virtue ethics in general, which is very important domain of ethics, but also Sufism and the emphasis on the polishing of the the mirror, the heart, it doesn't lend itself naturally to respond to these pertinent ethical and social questions about gender equality, about the workplace, about issues of rights and wrong. Because one could say that if I polish my distance from myself and material possessions, I might not be even touched by the crisis in Lebanon. Not because even if you take my money, even if corrupt politicians take my money, I wouldn't be fighting for it because I'm not interested in that. I've liberated myself from all the stuff. Nothing in the world can touch me, including corruption. So why should I go and demonstrate, for example, against it? How can I relate the virtues of Sufism to political action? To be part of a party, to fight for something. So in a way, I find this aspect needs to be developed, or it might be said, look, this is something else. This has to be dealt with at a different level. These only are ways of purifying yourself for certain purposes, but maybe some of these purposes might be at odds with other purposes that are social. My independence from the material world and what happens outside might make my engagement at a different level reduced to that extent. Is there a way to, if the aim is to bring Sufism and to address contemporary issues, and I don't like to speak in terms of contributing to the Western debate or the Western discourse, but contributing to important issues, whether it's Western or not, doesn't matter. These are important questions, and one needs to find what extent Sufism and the focus on the self might not turn out to be a mere therapeutic, which I don't undermine the importance of the therapeutic, but it will become a therapeutic rather than engagement in social issues that are, in our minds, connected with the ethical inquiry in general. That includes justice, fairness, and other values of that nature. And the use of violence and all of these things, one would use violence to justify it or not. Is there a place for that within Sufi ethics? I'll stop here. Maybe
فيني راح احكي بالعربي لانه عندي شيء للدكتوراه.
انا كنت احكي شويه بالعربي بخصوص هذا اللي حكيته، بس اذا انت فيك تحكي بالعربي يكون احسن.
لا انا في الحقيقه كمان انا I will engage with you. يعني برأيي مش يعني في لازم نفكر ليس بانه يا ناخذ الاخلاق على الطريقه الارسطوطاليه يعني الفضائل virtue ethics او نعمل على طريقه كانت ورولز، بمعنى إن نفصل بين الخير وبين العدل ونعمل الأشكالية اللي أنت عم تطلب منا بشار هلأ نعملها. أنا بشوف إنه الموضوع مش هذا أو هذا، الموضوع في الحقيقة بيحتاج لاثنين. وأنا بدي سعاد وغنى يصلحوا لي إذا فاتني غلط، بس التأكيد بالفكر الصوفي على السير والطريق وليس الهدف في الحقيقة معناه وكأنه عم بيقولوا لنا بأنه في فضائل لازم نهتم فيها شو ما كان النتائج، يعني الصبر، الشجاعة، الإخلاص، الرحمة، الحلم، يلي هذا مستوى نحن لازم نشتغل على حالنا فيه. وفي مستوى ثاني هو اللي عم نحكي عليه بشار، بأنه المستوى الثاني بأنه بأي لحظة التضحية مثلا لما نلاقي حالنا أمام معضلات دايليماز، بدنا نضحي بهذا ولا بهذا وهكذا. فيعني أنا بشوفه مش either or، بشوفه أكثر إنه بالحقيقة بحاجة لهذا وبحاجة لهذا. وانا راح اوقف.
بس اضافه كمان حتى ارجع اربط حديثي وحديثك كمان بالسؤال موجه، هو يعني اذا اخذنا ملاحظتك عن انه بحاجه للحكمه مع الرحمه لنعرف امتى الرحمه تتجاوز حد بهذا المحل، امتى بصير الرحمه لايسنس افصل الخطا،
امتى بتصير الحكمه هي اللي بتعطي الرحمه معنى. لانه اذا بترحم شخص في موقع من المواقع، مثلا ولدك بدك تربيه، اذا ما بتقاسه بمكان من الامكنه يعني
لازم عشان ايه؟
يعني بالنسبه للرحمه هيك بالمطلقه بدون ما يكون في لها حدود، هي غير قابله للحياه، بتصير رحمه بدون مردود انساني، بدون مردود اجتماعي لها. يعني انا بقدر اكون رحيمه بكل الاوقات، كثير سهل علي. مثلا ولا شخص اذاني بتجاوز، شخص ثاني بحسن له، بس هل يا ترى فكرت انه الاحسان الى هذا، هل انا بتصرف بناء على رحمتي فقط ولا بتصرف بناء على ما يحتاجه هذا الآخر؟ فاذا الحكمه هي انظر الى هذا الاخر وارى ما هي الرحمه بهذا الاخر، فانا حددت الرحمه اللي طالعه، انا قادره على كذا مستوى من الرحمه، فبالتالي انا يمكن اقاصص وانا حزينه، وانما ارى القصاص عنده رحمه. لكن اذا ما تقاصص ممكن يتطور اشياء ثانيه انه غير سليمه يعني. فمن هون ضروره انه نجمع بين الرحمه وبين الحكمه. شنو هلا هيك رحمه هيك ارحم كل البشر بالكائنات، لا شك نرحمهم، بس نرحمهم بحكمه. هذه المساله. واكيد يعني مثلا الجانب يعني الاخلاقي بالمجتمع انه في تضحيه، اكيد في تضحيه، ضحك. صحيح العالم الغربي الكونسبت، فكره التضحيه صارت مليئه عنده. اليوم ما بيقدر الانسان الغربي يضحي، بنشوفها بالافلام، وليش انا بدي اضحي بحياتي؟ عايشه مره واحده ما مستعد اضحي لا لولد ولا لزوج ولا اي شيء. فدائما صار بياخذ قراره بناء على المصلحه اللي هي بتخصه. بعدنا نحن بمجتمعاتنا التضحيه قيمه، بس هل يا ترى بالغرب التضحيه قيمه؟ انا ما وجدت انه التضحيه قيمه في الغرب، بس لا تزال قيمه عنها. يعني المراه اللي بتضحي مشان اولادها وبتعيش معهم كل حياتها مثلا، سواء انا مش شابه او زوجها مش على زوجها او اي شيء اخر، هذه تقدر بمجتمعاتنا. يعني نحن عندنا رأي عام اجتماعي عم بيعطي هذه القيمة، إذا كانت سواء قيمة دينية، يمكن الدين ما بيأمر بهالشيء، بس أحيانا هي قيمة متفق عليها يعني اجتماعيا. فمن هون إنه لما الإنسان بيضحي في مسألة كثير مهمة، وهي تقدير الذات. اليوم أنا كيف بدي أتصالح مع ذاتي؟ وكيف إذا ما قدرت ذاتي؟ إذا بتوصل لمحل أنا بتصرف بالتصرف احتقرت في نفسي، مستحيل أتصالح مع ذاتي. يعني كل ما بتصرف تصرف وأنا راضي عن هذا السلوك وعن هذا التصرف، وحاسة إنه هذا عمل نبيل وهذا ما يجب أن يكون، بيجي المردود علي إني أقدر ذاتي. فرق كثير بين تقدير الذات وبين حب الأنا. مش معناتها انه اقدر ذاتي معناتها اني انا لشهواتي واهوائي وكذا. فبظن انه نحن احيانا هذه مسائل لازم تدخل بالتربيه، هذه مسائل لازم تدخل بالاعلام، يعني لها تجليات كثيره، بس انه وحتى بالفلسفه يعني بتطرح اشكاليه فلسفيه انه بس يعني نعود الولد على انه تقدير الذات يحترم ذاته. لأن الإنسان اللي بدون قيم بدون قيمة، حتى بالنسبة لنا أي إنسان بتكون أنت بتحترمه أساساً، بس تشوف إنه بدون قيم يفقد احترامه، يفقد قيمته عندك. فمن هون إنه إنه لها علاقة القيم بقيمة الإنسان واحترامه لذاته. طبعا في تضحيات موسوم يعني هيك. والغريب إنه الملاحظات يعني إنه في فتوى بالفقه، يعني ممكن نحصل على إذا نسينا بصلاة، إذا صار بدنا أي شيء بدنا فتوى نروح لعالم فقيه. أما بالنسبة للأخلاق مستحيل يكون في مفتين، كل إنسان هو بده ياخذ قرار الأخلاقي، يعني الكاهن الأخلاقي الفاعل الأخلاقي هو بده ياخذ القرار، لأنه نحن كل يوم بياخذنا عشرات القرارات الأخلاقية، بينما بنحتاج يمكن بالشهرين مرة لفتوى شرعية. فإذا نحن متابعين الكاهن الأخلاقي نبنيه شيء منظومة أخلاقية. وبالغرب يعني اليوم أنا أحيانا بسأل بلادي اللي ساكنين برا إنه كيف بيتعاملوا أخلاقيا مع البلد؟ لأنه نحن مثلا إذا بده يكذب بنقول له حرام، هل بالغرب كلمة حرام مش موجودة، بس القبول الاجتماعي ناتج من الصدق. يعني برا بيقول للأولاد إنه إذا كذبت بتكون أصحابك، بل حدا يعاشرك، يعني الخلق مبدأ الاجتماعي أسد، مبدأ المعاشرة. فمن هون إنه يعني نطرح، يعني جيد نطرح الأشياء على مستوى الإشكاليات والنظريات، بس إحنا عندنا مشاكل حقيقية بالاستقرار على الأرض، والخلق على محور الإنسان. فمن هون علاقتنا مع كل شخص وشخصه مش هناك التصور للدول، لأنه كان في علاقات بين شخص وإنسان عم يشتغل على نفسه، استخدمنا كلمة يشتغل على نفسه. يعني هون الإنسان هو المحور يقتنع ما فينا نعمل أخلاق إنسانية للمجتمع، ما في قانون علمي.
حترك الحديث المداخلات أول شيء إذا حدا من الإديتورز ضيوفنا على الأونلاين دكتور خليل بحب يضيفوا شيء وبعدين نرجع نفتح النقاش للحضور. Sorry, I should have spoken in English, I guess, at this point. We are now inviting our guests online, the editors of the book, Dr. Orfan, Dr. Rustam, and Dr. Khalil, to give their feedback on what they've heard or the afterthoughts they might have as a result of the general interventions here, the other interventions here. So please, the floor is yours. Anybody who would like to say something in response to what has been said so far.
I defer first to Bilal and Atif. If you guys have something to add or comments to make, you know, we can do it that way.
Go ahead, Muhammad, if you have something to say. I mean,
yeah. I do. All right.
Raise your voice, please.
Hang on one second. I'm bring the mic very close to me. Hang on one second. How is this better?
Yeah, it's okay.
All right. So first of all, it was such a pleasure listening to each of you speak. Professor Al-Hakim, I could hear you talk for forever, and I feel like I'm in a different place. I don't even. So, you know, it was just wonderful. Each of you had really excellent insights. And a number of the problems raised are actually addressed in the volume, which is good because that shows that, you know, we're all kind of thinking about the same things in the same ways, but also leaving it open for a constructive discussion. Let me just begin with one of the points that I found extremely useful, especially because this is something that I'm normally telling my own students. It has to do with the therapeutic value of Sufism. Professor Bashar al-Haidar spoke about it. Actually, each of you did. And Rina Ismail in particular, Professor Ismail, she mentioned the relationship of healing, this kind of auto-healing, what they call auto-healing today, and its relationship to the therapeutic dimensionality of the self and how the self can be cured through the practice of Sufism, whether one is involved with Sufism existentially or not. Now, I know that this works because, I teach courses in Islamic studies, but also in Western philosophy, global philosophy, and in contemplative mystical traditions. And often I get students who come to the table with very little background in religion, usually they're from post-secular Christian backgrounds, and they don't really know much about, 10 years ago, you could have assumed that they knew some Bible, but even then, they don't know about the Bible. So we have to really begin with basics. And when I'm presenting Sufism to them, I often try to explain to them that, it is essentially a way of remedying that aspect of the self that feels fallen, that feels alienated in this world, that feels more or less like it doesn't belong here. Everybody has that feeling, and we have different ways of dealing with it. Global literature, the more one is immersed in different literary traditions, let's say Japanese literature or Persian literature or West African literature for that matter, you see that the sense of alienation and the need to recover that fallen nature of the human being is quite common, thematically speaking. But in Sufism, when I try to tell these students situating this problem globally, that we all feel this kind of loss and angst and this desire to recover, Sufism's message is, first you need to know what a self is. What is a self? What are we speaking about when we speak about the self? That's why Professor Ismail's point about, what is the self in its multidimensional nature that the Sufis are speaking about when they speak about conquering the self or overcoming the self. And I tell them that, if you look at the word self in different languages, of course, there are all kinds of connections between selfhood and transcendence. My favorite example is from Persian, where you have the word khud, which means self in Persian, but it comes etymologically from the word khuda, God. Right? And it's something that's not a popular insight in Pakistan today, by the way. There's historical reasons for that, but it's a well-known observation that khud and khuda are etymologically related in ancient Pahlavi language, of course, and in New Persian, Middle Persian. So what's the relationship between a self and its divine nature, or something to do with khudi in its true selfhood, divineness within the individual? So then I explained to them that, the Sufis, their art really, it's to overcome that sense of loss by returning back to a more whole sense of the self. Now, every student, whether they're religious or not, in my own experience, they all like that very much. They all feel, connected to that insight, a sense of recovery, a sense of discovery, and the joy of the recovery of the beloved within the self. And I always take it back to love. So you have this notion of the recovery of the self and the idea of figuring out what a self is, but of course there's this divine nature to it, and then getting to the nature of selfhood and getting to that self through the door of love. So you can intellectualize what a self is, but you're not going to really know until you start applying it to the love relationships that you enter into the world. Now, all of these students who theoretically would be falling asleep, once love comes up, their radars go up, right? Everybody likes to talk about love, right? Nobody knows what it is, but we all want it. And we're all mired in it like fish in water. We can't really ever get at it, but we know it's there and it sustains us. So I tell them that, well, the Sufis' insight is that just because just as the self is related to God, so too is love, because love is God and God is love. Right? One of the divine names, Al-Wadud, means the lover. So I always tell my students, next time you give the Friday khutbah, mention that in the sermon, speak about God as a lover, speak about God as the beloved. So we're seeking something, a sense of wholeness and a kind of recovery of ourselves, but it's related to the nature of the divine, who's love. So really what we're seeking here when we seek wholeness is we're seeking love. Whatever form of love we seek, Rumi tells us, it ultimately takes us back to God, who's the Supreme Beloved. Rumi says, whatever love you have, if it's here or if it's for there, in the end, all of that love takes you back to God. So as I see it, the raison d'être of Sufism, really it's this kind of recovery of the self and a discovery of the self, which is the divine rooted in the human being. And the quickest way, the surest way, the most direct access to that is through love. Now, of course, the methods and all of these things that they speak about, this is another discussion altogether, but that's kind of the theoretical scaffolding that informs this perspective or this edifice, that really it's rooted in a return to the self, return to what a person is. So that kind of sense of emptiness when we fall in love, for example, notice how it disappears, at least for that brief moment. I often tell my students, when you fall in love, what happens? So we start writing on the board, what are the symptoms of love and loverhood? And they love this exercise because I tell them, look, you're all lovers. I ask them, who here has ever not fallen in love? Most of them put their hand up to, they say they have. One or two don't. And I say, this one who hasn't, this guy should put two hands up because he's usually the biggest of the ashiqeen and muhibbeen in the class. So it's something that we all seek. And so the Sufis say that to seek love, it's really to seek yourself. And when you love somebody, what you love about them and in them and through your acts of generosity is, in a sense, a part of you. That's why when people fall in love, they use the language in so many world literatures as union and coming together and joining and oneness and wholeness, because wholeness is a kind of holiness. So I hope that speaks to some of the points that were raised when it comes to the question of the nature of the therapeutic dimension of Sufism, that it's essentially designed to help human beings recover themselves. That's, as far as I can see, what the Sufi path is really all about, becoming a whole human being. One point that Professor Haider made, which I also thought was extremely important, has to do with the question of Sufism in political life and activism in the world. And there are so many beautiful stories in the Sufi tradition which tell us about precisely this point, because you often have this kind of tension amongst certain kinds of individuals, some of whom are less activist by nature, or who feel that, by being overly active in the world, they're somehow falling away from their spiritual role. And of course, the person of the Prophet is the most total example for the Sufis. And so really in him, you get this degree of great introspection, but also activity in the world. And the Sufis don't dichotomize between these two perspectives. It's not a question of the distinction between acting and not acting. In Taoism, you have the concept called wu wei, or actionless action. So many of the Sufis emphasize this dimension of human being, that you can actually be extremely active without actually being physically active in the world. I remember reading in one Sufi source, there's a hadith, afdalu sadaqa dhikrullah. The greatest form of charity that you can give is the remembrance of God. Give that to the world, because you start radiating that presence in the world. And that's what the dhikr is meant to do. It's meant to bring the presence of God into the world. And of course, in the modern period, we have so many examples of people who were immersed in Sufism existentially, but who were very politically active. People look at the freedom fighters over the last 200 years. Everyone from Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, of course, to Sheikh Shamil Dagestani, Uthman Dan Fodio, so many examples of individuals who were very deeply committed to real political action in a world and in a time when it was most needed and necessary. But let me just give one more example, which is, again, going back to Rumi's Masnavi, just to highlight kind of the tension that Professor Haider spoke about, because there isn't one clear-cut answer, as far as I could see in Sufism, to this question, because it's a variegated tradition and there are different kinds of people. There's one story in the Masnavi it's called the story of the Sufi in the garden, where there's a Sufi sitting in the garden, his head is in his navel, so he's in a deep zikr position, in a deep meditative posture. And this man comes up to the Sufi and says to him, hey, you, he kicks him, and he says, look, there's this, look at the world around you. Unzuru ila athari rahmatillah, he says. And you're paying attention to what's inside here, but look at, you're missing everything out here. Look at all of this. And the Sufi looks at him and says, no, no, no. What you are seeing are the atharu athari rahmatillah. You're seeing the traces of God's mercy. I'm with the traces of the divine mercy. So again, it's not meant to be a totalizing response or to, kind of essentialize or characterize Sufism in one way, but that shows that there's this, attitude in Sufism which has to do with a kind of activism within, which in many cases leads to an activism without, activism in the world. Sometimes it does not. That's all that I have to say.
Yeah. Anyone from the virtual world would like, please raise your hand if you have, okay, if not, we can ask the audience also. And, yeah. Can you give, raise your voice, please.
بالحياة الروحية والعبادات تنظيم بين الحياة الروحية والعبادات وكيف نسير بالطريق الأخلاق بما أنه اليوم نحن عم نحكي عن الأخلاق يعني الحياة الروحية غلبت على الحياة الروحية عند المسلمين فإذا عم نحكي عن الأخلاق عندهم أكثر مرتبطة بالفقه منا بالحياة الروحية فكيف نرجع نعمل هاللينك بين الأخلاق وبين الحياة الروحية لأنه مثل ما قلتي ما في الأخلاق حدا بيحط بوليس بالأخلاق ما بنشوفها فكيف نحن عايشين الأخلاق بس فقهيا وما رابطينها بين الحياة الروحية.
Yeah, please.
I want to ask,
raise your voice, please. Yeah.
Okay, my question is, do you feel that the main impact of Sufism on the self is one of deconstruction and deconditioning of our social and cultural world? If so, hypothetically speaking, could it be the solution in creating a basis for an all-inclusive and all-encompassing ethics?
Any other question? Yeah. Here.
بس عليكم على انا والدكتور حيدر موضوع انه نعرف انه الصوفيه يهتموا بكتابه الاخلاق والسلوك يهتموا بكتابه الدراسات ولكن الامر ما بس مش محدود فقط بالصوفيه انما الاسلام بشكل عام اعتمد هذا الجانب الاخلاقي في القرآن أو الحديث النبوي، فليش فقط التركيز على مدرسة الصوفية بالواقع الاجتماعي الوقت اللي إنه فينا ننظر بشكل أوسع لما بالمنظور الأخلاقي بالإسلام ننطبق على المجتمع.
I have a question. Yeah, Mizuki. Yeah.
I'd like to clarify the definition of Sufism itself. I'm not really sure what is Sufism, especially in a relationship between religion and the philosophy and also psychology. Because you kind of use the word of Islam and theology and also philosophy interchangeably in your presentation as well. And hearing that, I kind of that still kind of reminds me of the mindfulness in my understanding, just like a tool to be able to understand myself and able to understand inner self. Then I kind of confuse the relationship between mindfulness and Sufism, religion, and also psychology and philosophy. So I would appreciate you kind of like position the Sufism itself in the relationship.
Yeah, it is.
This question is from Dr. Stone. When I was reading the piece this week, I found it so fascinating. Actually, when I was reading certain parts of it, many parts of it, I felt like I was reading one of my favorite Catholic theologians in the US, and it reminded me a lot about how a lot of modern day Catholic theologians speak in the US about religion, speak about love. And I'm wondering if you notice this connection also, where maybe not just with Catholicism, but with other religions. And what does this kind of implicate, that there's so many connections between religions, or do you have any other insights for this?
Actually, my question also is related to Mizuki and Elizabeth, and my question also to add more confusion to Mizuki. Confusion. Where we can talk about specificity of Sufism compared to the major trend of mysticism. Why I'm asking that? Because really, after reading Taha Abdul Rahman, I was for long impressed by how he created from Sufist ethics a discipline and create a system of thought. But then when I was frustrated when he argued that this is only Sufism, so and to the point that he argued that we can reach the system only through Sufism, and he antagonized so much the West by saying, by almost arguing that in the West there is no ethics anymore, something like that. I mean, he is very harsh in his dichotomy between materialism and or Dahriyin, what he called about it. So here where my question is simply that how much all these beautiful ideas we hear from you all apply to other mysticism, and where we can talk about really typical and Islamic Sufism that we don't find it elsewhere. Yeah, so I'll stop here.
I think we have enough questions for the answer. I think we can start with to answer the questions that were
حجرت على السؤال لماذا تأسيسا الصوفية ليس يعني إنه الأخلاق في الإسلام أوسع من الحيز الصوفي. السؤال على إنه يعني في قيادة للفكر الفقهي لمجتمعاتنا. ما في قيادة، وإن كان هو الشيخ على الأرض، بس ما فيها القيادة لعامة الناس. دائما الإنسان مقطوع بأي مشكلة وبيطلب لها جواب، أول ما بيخطر بباله الفقر، حتى لو مسألة أخلاقية بيخطر بباله الفقر. ليه؟ لأنه يتصدر لتقوى الناس. فمن هون إنه إذا رجعنا لتاريخ الفكر الأخلاقي للإسلام، وهذا السبب كان وراء إني قمت بهذا العمل، إني حاولت أعمل استقلال لعلم التصوف عن قطاعات العلوم الأخرى كلها حتى نستقل عن التصوف، لأنه كثير من مؤلفينا والفلاسفة العرب المصريين لما كتبوا بالفكر الأخلاقي اعتبروا مثلا أحمد محمود صبحي الفلسفة الأخلاقية، يعتبر إنه الصوفي هو اللي كان الفيلسوف الأخلاقي عبر التاريخ. فإذا في نوع من الاختصاص. حأرجع للغزالي، لأن الغزالي مع الغزالي بوضح لنا نقطة كثير مهمة. بيقول لنا مثلا ليش؟ لأن الغزالي أهميته إنه هو عالم صوفي وليس شخص بس حكى عن تجربته الشخصية. يعني هو انتقل من الذاتي إلى الموضوع. بس لهذا السبب إحياء علوم الدين كتاب عام، كتاب علمي، وليس كتاب يروي تجارب روحية لشخص. فمن هون إنه هو كعالم صوفي بيقلنا بالمقدمة إنه العلوم الصوفية نوعين: علوم المعاملة وعلوم المكاشفة. علوم المعاملة هي موجودة بإحياء علوم الدين، العبادات والمعاملات وكلها اللي بدنا نعملها مشاهدة للتحليل للتفكير. هلا علوم المكاشفات في رزق خاص. الإنسان لما بيشتغل على تطهير الأعماق، على جلاء مرآة القلب، ينعكس فيها العلوم، تجي العطاءات. الهدف، وهذا اللي خلاني انقل من الصوفي الى الاستقلال مثلا الاخلاق، انه الصوفي الهم الصوفي عبر التاريخ كان انه يوصل الشخص ليكون من الاولياء. كان هم الانسان الصوفي الولايه. انا عندي شهيد الابد بالثالث الهجري لما بلشت فكره الولايه تنطلق. مع وصلت للخامس الهجري كان عندهم هدف انه من الجانب الاخلاقي، المعاملات والتزكيه والتطهير وكل هالامور، انه يوصلوا ليصيروا بالعلوم اللي هي فيها الكشوف واللي فيها القرب من الله. وطبعا الولايه تعرفوا انه لها الجانبين: الجانب المعرفي والجانب الكرامات والتصريف. فاذا الهم الصوفي يختلف عن الهم المفكر الاخلاقي او المصلح الاخلاقي بهالزمان او العالم الاخلاقي. الهم الاخلاقي هو المجتمع، بينما الهم الصوفي لا، اكثر يتعلق بالشخص بوصوله لمراتب الولايه ليروح لعلم المكاشفه. فاذا الغزالي حسمها، تكلم في علم المعامله وسكت عن علم المكاشفه، نعتبره شيء خاص. بالنسبه للوجود وين نحن بنلاقي حضور النص الاخلاقي بالاسلام؟ بنلاقي النص الاخلاقي في كذا مدرسه: مدرسه الوعاظ، بيشتغلوا على القران الكريم ليشوفوا المفاهيم الاخلاقيه في القران، بيشتغلوا على الحديث النبوي الشريف ليشتغلوا على المدرسه الحديثيه، في عنا الفلسفه الاخلاقيه اشتغلوا عليها، في عنا يعني حتى الموسوعيين واشتغلوا على. فاذا الفكر الاخلاقي الاسلامي اللي نتج عن النص الاسلامي كان موجود بكل المدارس العلوم الاسلاميه. لهذا السبب ما كان له استقلال. هذا شغل هذا الكتاب. انا حاولت ان اتكلم في الهجري، استقلت العلوم، صار في العلم له كيان وله رجالاته وله نصوصه. فاذا نحن محتاجين اليوم، خصوصا من زماننا في حاجه للاخلاق، محتاجين اما من نصوص ومن المدارس نعمل استقلال لنبين بدون قطيعه مع الماضي، نبين كل المدارس ونعمل استقلال ونعرف شو هو علم الاخلاق وشو هي المعارف الضروريه، شو هي الصناعات الضروريه اللي نحن لازم نشتغل عليها الانسان فينا. لأن كل انسان هو لازم يشتغل على نفسه ليكون في حق. يعني ما فينا نقول تماما الناس انه روحوا انتصروا للتصوف، يعني ما هو الحل. فالحل انه الهم الاخلاقي هو هم اجتماعي، وليس هم انه الشخص اللي بيوصل لمراتب. هذا ما بيمنع هذا، بس اليوم في حاجه له هو ان نخرج بالتصوف لناخذ ما يفيد المجتمع، في اجتماعنا البشري. ظن انه يعني آن الاوان كمان انه تتوسع الخيارات والقيادات، انه مش نضل القياده احاديه اللي هو قياده للفكر الفقهي، لان المفروض يكون في قياده كمان للفكر الاخلاقي، لكن في انواع
Do you want to respond to the last question? Then we can also. I don't know which one you choose. Okay. Then I will.
Dr. Rustom, would you like to go first? Here on.
Go ahead, Ghina, and then I'll comment on Sari's question.
All right.
But go ahead.
So there are several points that can be commented on, but I tried to link them to my brief talk that was focused on psychology and how we can benefit from Sufi insights and vice versa. Dr. Bashar had posed the dilemma of whether Sufism can be of benefit to handling social ethical dilemmas.
Questions in general.
For questions in general. And somebody in the audience also asked about how Sufism relates to Islam. Okay, so I'm not qualified to answer this as a historian or a theologian, but as a psychologist, what I see in Sufism and how it relates to Islam is relevant. To me, not as a psychologist, but as an interested reader in Sufism, is that it's an issue of focus. So in every broad life vision, there are different approaches, different lenses that can be applied. So Sufism is that lens which is concerned with experiencing some of the theological motives on the inner side. Okay, there is that concern in Sufism. This is why it has been defined by some as delineating the experiential path to realizing some ideas. So, and this is why it's important to understand the potential that comes with that and the limitations that come with that. So when Dr. Haidar posed that, what comes to my mind is sometimes when I'm working with my students on formulating cases in a psychological lens, I will notice that my students completely, for example, overlook that a family we're working with can hardly eat. Okay, they don't have the means to eat. They're living in poverty. And they start applying some psychological analytical angle to understand why this family is suffering. And I tell them, please don't psychologize the case. You have to attend first to economic and social aspects before we apply this in-depth psychological. So it's important to understand what is the point of focus of this science that we're talking about, science of Sufism and it applies to it. Yes, there is a focus. It's not meant to exclude or substitute other schools or other approaches, but it can offer an interesting and important complement, okay, to those other schools and approaches. Dr. Rustom ended his talk with a very interesting sentence about something that is activism within that may translate in activism without. And what's particularly important about this conclusion is that Sufism takes into account, because it's concerned with the inner dimension, it has been historically concerned with delineating different temperaments. So it recognizes that some human beings may be more on the, using psychological modern language, may be more on the introverted side, and it allows for that. And it takes into consideration that some people can be more the warrior or activist side, and it allows for that. However, its focus is, yes, on the inner. Okay, but what you do with that is going to be up to temperament, up to what you do with that. And as Dr. Rustom alluded, there are lots of political warriors. And Abdul Zayed comes to mind as one of these. And about, I concur with Dr. Bashar that it's important that we, and with what the young lady here, I don't know your name, sorry, you're writing, said about can Sufism, can Sufism offer a lens on universal dimensions? And another one of your
your students talk about the interface between Sufism and other spiritual disciplines, this actually can be a very interesting topic in and of itself. I think these are very different questions, and there's a lot to be talked about that. And I can actually give lots of examples about that based on my interest, given my psychological role, but I don't think this is the time and place for that. But this definitely merits a talk in and of itself. But I confirm Dr. Bashar that it would be more conducive not to speak of a boundary, rigid boundary between East and West, okay, because of the nature of the global world we live in today. So let's take one of the ideas that recurred, whether it was mentioned under the title of self-transcendence or sacrifice. Dr. Zayed mentioned the example of the woman sacrificing, for example, for her children, the context of family. Now, let me use this interesting example to illustrate what may be the focus of a Sufi or psycho-spiritual discourse in connection with that. Is the sacrifice, what is it motivated by? Is it true sacrifice? I mean, is she staying in the family because of perhaps financial pressures? Maybe she's been raised in a matriarchal society and she cannot make it on her own. Maybe what looks like a sacrifice, and to bring this back home to our culture, in our culture we tend to be very sentimental people, and we're quick to attach virtues to things that we may have done for non-virtuous reasons. We are not judging the woman who stays in the family for financial reasons, but I cannot really label this exactly as an ethical action. Okay? So why is she in that system? And it's legitimate to stay for financial reasons. There's nothing wrong with that. If anything, one way I've conceived of Sufi ethics over years of reading it as the ethics of possibilities. This discussion you have with the seekers or disciples or individuals not on a Sufi path about what your motive is so that you can have a fruitful discussion about what they're willing to give up and what they're not willing to give up. This is why when we take into account or we start to think of Sufism as the science of possibilities, as the science that takes into account the multi-layered aspect of the human self, then you can be more open to accept people with their varied sensibilities. This is why Sufism is not about some other vision, alternate vision to Islam. It is embedded in Islam and in the Quran, okay? But it tries to see beyond the letter, okay? Back to the question that Dr. Hassan Abul posed about why people are likely to engage in ritual, divorced from spiritual awareness. From a psychological point of view, what comes to my mind is, I mean, socially speaking, we can say that Sufi is more dominant, okay? But psychologically speaking, because it's easier. It's easier to, behaviors, action, do's and don'ts appear to be easier on some level. Oftentimes when people even come to the clinic, the question after delineating something is, what shall I do? Okay, tell me what to do. Okay. Now, interestingly, people are not always seriously about implementing what you're going to tell you anyway. Sometimes you're asked, so you can tell them, and then they can tell you why you're not going to do what you told them to do. And this is why being aware of the psychology behind certain questions becomes interesting. But it's still something that people perceive as easier. Okay, when people have become impatient and angry at the process of life they're living, or they're angry at the God they used to be worshiping, that anger prompts them to come and put you in the dilemma. You tell me what I should do. Okay, and I mean, usually we don't know, we have parameters. Ethics is about parameters, it's about posts. Okay, guiding posts, but it's difficult to say. I mean, we tend to, I'm not to end with this, we tend to think that this mantra that has become recurrent in recent psychological literature about the psychologist not telling the client what they should do because we honor clients' feelings, we honor clients' choices. In one sense, this could be a modern ethic of that it's equated with individualism. But on a different sense, if we want to look for the interface between this and Sufism, actually what's embedded in this is something much deeper. It could be that me and the client are in agreement that I want to have that client have a more fulfilling life that's more ethical, not only on the personal, but also interaction between her and her family, let's say. She wants to be a better wife, and that's a legitimate cause. I don't actually stop my clients from having ethical motives, as some people might think. I want to be a better mother. I want to be a better wife. These are all legitimate. But the how is usually not something that we can offer in recipes, okay? The how, here we go back to the idea of what is the motive of the person. I mean, it can range from this lofty idea we heard about today, encountering the direct vision with God, to doing just the right thing, to satisfying my family. And Islam as a religion, because it's a religion for everybody, it has allowed for all these different possibilities. So in a way, it is broader than Sufism, but Sufism is in a way goes deeper. So it goes deeper in terms of trying to uncover what your motives are and what are the possibilities that you are willing to go after.
بلال بس بدها تحكي سعاد دقيقة.
يعني السيطرة العقل الفقهي إذا حبينا على جزء كثير كبير من التاريخ جعل الإنسان مثل النظام إذا قام بالأركان إنه كمل الإسلام، بكفي إنه بيصلي بيصوم مع بيعطي الزكاة وبيحج، إنه بيعتبر حاله يعني ملتزم بالإسلام وبكل هذا مستحيل. وهذا الإنسان الصوفي اللي عم نحاول إن إحنا نقوله واللي قاله الغزالي أيضا إنه الأخلاق جزء لا يتجزأ من إسلام الإنسان. المسألة مش خيارية ولا زيادات. من هون كانت اللي وضعوها يعني بمقاصد الشريعة أحيانا وضعت إنه الأخلاق من التحسينات، وهون كانت الإشكالية الكبرى. هي الأخلاق من الضروريات مش من التحسينيات. وهون اللي الشغل الإمام الغزالي إنه لما اعتبر إنه علوم المعاملة هي الأرض المشتركة بين الفقه وبين التصوف، والخلق جزء لا يتجزأ من الإسلام. مسألة يعني إنه ما خيارية، لهالسبب إنه ما في ضل الفكر الكفر الحلال بين والحرام بين بمسائل العبادات. بس إذا ذهبنا للأخلاق مثل ما أشار دكتور سالي، بنروح لمنطقة أحيانا فيها رمادي، منطقة مش دايما أبيض وأسود. يعني الخيارات الأخلاقية مش دايما واضحة. لهالسبب الإنسان بصير عنده أزمة أخلاقية، لهالسبب بصير إنه أي أفضل. لهالسبب نحن بنشعر اليوم إنه نحن ما عم نختار الخير 100% الصرف، عم نختار أهون الشرور يعني وجودها بالمجتمعات. فإذا صارت الخيارات يعني أيضا مختلفة، وصار الإنسان هو لازم ضميره يحكم ضميره ويحكم قلبه. ولو أفتوا كل الناس بالموقف الأخلاقي، هذا كثير موقف بده في خيارات وفي أزمات. وبتعرفوا أنتم لما بتتعارض قيمتين أي قيمة بنختار، يعني هذه المشكلة.
بلال is your turn.
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone. I'll tackle Sari's question because it's a very interesting one to me. I'm of course not a specialist on Abdurrahman Taha Abdurrahman, and I cannot speak on his behalf or about his philosophy. But the question that you raised, Sari, I've heard it many times, right? I'll give you one example. A few years ago, around 4 or 5 years ago, Brill Publishers invited me and 5 other scholars, we were 6 scholars of Sufism, to establish a new encyclopedia. Now, the question came, what do we call it? Do we call it Encyclopedia of Islamic Mysticism or Encyclopedia of Sufism? And Sari, you can't believe it. We spent 4 days just trying to agree whether it's Encyclopedia of Sufism or Encyclopedia of Islamic Mysticism. The arguments were, I'm going to summarize them. Some scholars, non-Muslims, cannot even imagine that Islam has a mystical dimension, right? How can a religion that is full of violence, full of insistence on every single aspect of the Sharia, insisting on the, take the, interpretation of the Quran literally, the meaning of the Quran literally, how can it have a mystical dimension? Now, also, some Muslim scholars don't like it to call it Islamic mysticism because the term denies the Sharia haqiqa binary relation, that unlike in Christianity, in Islam, you cannot just have, to focus about gnosis and mahabba without qiyam al-layl, without the dhikr, without salat, without siyam, without all these aspects. So Sharia and haqiqa together. So they insist on the term Sufism, but also scholars like the term Sufism because it reflects the historical development of Sufism as well. Now, we need, of course, we ended up, by the way, with Encyclopedia of Islamic Mysticism because it opens a comparative aspect, which we're interested in. But we're explaining in the introduction why we selected this term. Now, the scholars, and a very famous scholar, Anne-Marie Schimmel, her book is called Mystical Dimension of Islam, right? Where she explains that it's different from other mystical traditions, it's peculiar, and it's a mystical dimension within Islam. Of course, there is a problem also with this because the Druze is a mystical dimension of Islam, the Shia is a mystical dimension, the Ismailis has a mystical dimension as well, right? So the term is very problematic, of course. Now, we need not to forget that through its development, Sufism has also benefited from other mystical traditions. The relation between Buddhism and Sufism, for example. One of the early Sufis is Ibrahim ibn Adham. His story is the story of Buddha. A prince who finds a rabbit and was going hunting, and then he converts, and etc. You'll find many parallels. And historically, we also know that there was an influence from yoga on Sufi practices and vice versa, from Sufi practices on yoga. And Karl Ernst, for example, his most recent scholarship focuses on this, on the interaction also between Hinduism and Sufism. Of course, Christian mysticism was influenced by Muslim Sufism, but also vice versa. Sufism was, if you look at Sufi manuals, you'll find stories of the Rahban, of the Syriac Rahban, and you'll find prototypes there, and etc. Kabbalah, for example, also benefited from Sufism. So Sufism in its development, right, was in touch with this and in dialogue with these other mystical traditions. But perhaps what Taha Abdurrahman is wary of is that someone comes today and say, oh, I'm going to practice yoga. I'll pay $15 an hour or $10 an hour and go for 1 hour and I'm practicing yoga. I'm a mystic, right? To detach the physical aspect of yoga from the philosophical aspect of yoga, right, is dangerous. To say, for example, oh, now most Hollywood stars, they say they practice Kabbalah, right? They're not Jews, of course, right? And Kabbalah is the mystical dimension of Judaism. But so it's picking and choosing, right? I'm going to become a Sufi, a mystic, without becoming a Muslim. I'm going to practice dhikr and not become a Muslim. You have to take traditions are in dialogue all the time. This is a historical fact, right? Whether scholars like it or not, whether Sufis like it or not, whether mystics and other traditions like it or not, right? They borrow from each other all the time and they're in contact all the time. But you have to evaluate a system of thought in its entirety, basically. And that's probably what Taha Abdurrahman is talking about.
Thank you, Bilal.
I think we can end with this nice ending by Bilal explaining that. Although actually I'm still wondering maybe about what distinguishes the mystical dimension of Islam from the mystical dimensions essentially, not that the paraphernalia is Islamic, or the paraphernalia there is Hindu or Buddhist, or is there something that one can say a special or a unique aspect of Islamic mysticism, which is Sufism, compared to others? Is there Mahabba is there also in other mysticism?
Gnosis is
It's a very Christian.
Mahabba is there, humility is there. So, but what is there something that one can see as uniquely Islamic, other than the attached scriptures to it?
شوف, there is an attachment to scripture in even Sufism. Like, كل حقيقة تخالف شريعة فهي باطل, or etc. So think, for example, about Buddha, the Buddha figure. He's always fat and sitting, right? He's not doing these yoga exercises, right? Because he reached. He can now allow himself to be fat, right? He is grounded, right? So when you reach the haqiqah, you don't leave the sharia in Islam, in Sufism. Like they go together all the time. So you need to continue doing this qiyam al-layl, after this moment of gnosis, of ma'rifah, right, of kashf, right? You don't abandon your sharia. That I can say, for example, is one of the things that are special. But of course, we have to take things in their historical development too. I don't know if Mohammad you want to add about it. By the way, even in Islam, right, when I teach my Sufism class, the Shia students in the class usually say, no, you're not getting it. These Sufis are batil, they're haram. What they're doing is haram. Irfan is right, not Sufism, right? And I keep explaining to them that Irfan is a later development of Sufism, and you cannot basically pick and choose what is right and what is wrong. Irfan is Sufism still, but it's focused on Ma'rifah. Muhammad.
Okay, that is another excellent question. It ties in to what Sari had asked as well. So to go back to this course that I was mentioning that I teach, it's by far my most popular course at the university that I've been teaching for about a decade. It's called Mystical and Contemplative Traditions. And in it, basically what we do is we look at all of the claims that you find across the board in mystical dimensions of different religions. So the spiritual path of Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, so on and so forth, looking at the content of what we would refer to as mystical experience in each of these writings. And we also look at the theories of mysticism that exist amongst contemporary scholars today, like Stephen Katz and people like that. One of the things that emerges always is that there really is a common core of distinctive features that you find across the board in different traditions. Like some of you were mentioning, humility, love, the cultivation of the virtues. You won't find any tradition, as far as I could tell, that's concerned with the inner life, what we call mysticism, for lack of a better word, which is not concerned with the interiorization of the virtues and ultimately of the realization of a kind of ultimate selfhood. Nevertheless, there are distinctive features of each of these forms of mysticism. Like Bilal was saying, in Islamic mysticism, the rhetoric, the emphasis, the scriptural dimensions, the Sharia'ite basis, it really colors the prism through which what we would call mysticism in Islam is framed. Having said all of that, there is a really amazing book. I think the single best book that I've read on this question, but it's not really so well known outside of religious studies circles, which is a real shame. It's called Paths to Transcendence. Paths to Transcendence by Reza Shah Kazemi. Yeah, I can write it down in the chat function if you like.
Yeah.
His
Yeah,
name,
please.
yeah, Reza Shah Kazemi. He's written a number of excellent books. He also has a very good book on Islam and Buddhism. But this one here, Paths to Transcendence. And what he does in the book is precisely probe this question in a way that I've not seen before. He looks at 3 accounts of, well, again, what we would call mysticism in Christianity using Meister Eckhart's writings, Islam using Ibn Arabi, and Hinduism using Shankaracharya. So 3 of the greatest mysticisms, are representative, of mysticism in the pre-modern world. And he looks at not just the specifics of their worldviews, but the height of the mystical experience for each of them. So that's why it's called transcendence, right? And he comes up with some very astounding comparative analyses showing how they're distinctive, very distinctive. But nevertheless, there is a very common vision when it comes to the disintegration of the self and the reintegration of the self at higher levels, which is why I think that mysticism, or what we call mysticism, has so much to offer human beings today, because it gives them a path to understanding selfhood. The reason I say what we call mysticism, and I keep qualifying my language, is because in many of the Sufi texts, and this shocks people, especially when you speak to them, if they're familiar with one period of Sufism and you tell them, well, like one of the greatest, if not the single greatest book of Sufism is the encyclopedia, really, written by Ibn Arabi, Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah, which is like a commentary upon the Quran. That's really what the book is. And he uses the word tasawwuf sparingly. That's not his preferred term for mysticism at all. It's tahqiq. Same with Ain al-Quzat, the person about whom I wrote a book. The word Sufi shows up a handful of times in his writings. And it's not really a term that he associates any particular significance with. For him, it's more, faqr, realization, bi khudi, becoming nothing, selfless, becoming selfless. Ashiqi, the state of love, loverhood. Same with Rumi. The word Sufi, sometimes in Persian writings, the word Sufi, it's a pejorative term. Look at this Sufi, this kind of lazy bum sitting around, not working. You find that in Urdu literature too, right? The Sufi is not really always the realized person. It's the guy that doesn't want to work and who's blaming religion for his laziness. So you get that too. But in all of this, if we can just get rid of the terminology, there's a beautiful term, a beautiful definition by Sheikh Bushanji, the early Sufi master, where he says that, today, this is in the 9th century, 10th century, he says that today Sufism is a name without a reality, whereas in the past, it used to be a reality without a name. So really, they're seeking to get to that reality that Rumi speaks of when he says, اختلاف خلق از نام افتاد چون به معنا رفت آرام افتاد از نظرگاه هست مغز وجود اختلاف مؤمن و گبر و یهود. Rumi says that the differences that people have, it goes back to names. But when they get to the inner meaning, ma'na, they will find sukun, aram. It is from the different standpoints, just going back to that example Bilal started with on the elephant, the blind man, the elephant. It's from the different standpoints, maghz wujud, marrow of existence, that the differences come up between Jew, Zoroastrian, and Muslim.
Thank you very much. I would like to finish by thanking the audience for their virtue of patience, for the speakers for the virtue of generosity. I think you polished our minds, maybe possibly our hearts as well. But definitely our minds. So thank you all for being here, and we'll hope to have another similar discussion in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful evening.